Welcome. Good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us tonight for Keeping Your Seat to Take a Stand, Sarah Keys Evans and the Fight Against Jim Crow Transportation. My name is Christy Norris. I'm the Director of Carolina K-12 at UNC Chapel Hill, and we are so excited for this program tonight, which is co-sponsored by the Sarah Keys Evans Inclusive Art Project and also the North Caroliniana Society. And many of you tuning in tonight are K-12 teachers. A special welcome to all of you. And as you know, thanks to the wonderful appreciation shown for teachers by the North Caroliniana Society, and also with some extra funding from the Humanities for the Public Good initiative at UNC Chapel Hill, every K-12 teacher with us tonight in the virtual house gets to request a free book related to tonight's topics. And so my great colleague, Paul Benici, who's there behind the scenes, will pop in a form for you to fill out later this evening to make your choice of a book. You know, Teacher Appreciation Week just passed. I wish we could mail each of you a car, but we can at least do a book tonight. And ultimately, every single one of you with us tonight is in for a real treat as we learn about the incredible story of Mrs. Sarah Keys Evans, a North Carolina trailblazer who everyone should know about and everyone who's in the classroom should certainly teach about. So on August 1st, 1952, a young 22-year-old Sarah Keys was a private in the U.S. Women's Army Corps. And she was stationed in Fort Dix, New Jersey. She'd finally earned leave and was excited to return home to see her family in Washington, North Carolina. So she booked her ticket, specifically booking an interstate bus ticket. And as she traveled home, however, the bus stopped in Roanoke Rapids in Halifax County, North Carolina, that night for a bus driver changeover. And it's at this point during that change that the new driver gets on, rechecks tickets, and tells Mrs. Keys in her dress Army uniform to relinquish her seat to a white man and move to the back of the bus. But Sarah Keys knew her rights, and she stood, or rather sat, her ground. Remember that by 1952, several years had passed since the 1946 Supreme Court decision of Morgan versus Virginia. That case had struck down segregation on interstate bus travel 6 years earlier. And in fact, the very next year after the Morgan versus Virginia decision in 1947, the Congress of Racial Equality sent 16 Black and white civil rights activists to ride together on buses across the South to test whether states were upholding that Morgan versus Virginia ruling. And those so-called first freedom rides became known as the 1947 Journey of Reconciliation. And as we sit here today, this spring marks the 75th anniversary of those first freedom rides in 1947. And this included several stops across North Carolina, one of which was right here in Chapel Hill, which unfortunately included the riders being badly beaten. It also included their being sentenced in Hillsborough, North Carolina, to time on a chain gang in Roxborough. And that was obviously a wrongful conviction. So that's all to say, when Sarah Keys in 1952 was asked to give up her seat, she knew she shouldn't have to. She knew her rights and she refused. And I want to pause here for just a moment and let you hear this part of the story from Mrs. Keys Evans herself. This is just under 4 minutes of an interview with Sarah Keys Evans that I want to play for you. This is an interview by the Eastern Carolina Christian College and Seminary for the Sarah Keys Evans Inclusive Art Project, an incredible project which you'll learn about a little bit later. And we'll also make sure that we link to this full interview in the chat box. But for now, here's just a few minutes of Mrs. Sarah Keys Evans telling the story of what happened that night in 1952.
And when basic training ended, I said, voila, on to the next step. No, I think I was there about 9 months. I put in for my first visit to my hometown in Washington, North Carolina. I purchased my ticket and boarded a bus. It was a trailway bus. I boarded this bus to take my first journey home after entering the military. I had purchased my ticket, making sure that I had a straight-through bus, a bus with no changes. But to my surprise, when I got to Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina, there was a big problem, one I had not foreseen. The driver collected a little stub of everyone that was already seated, and when he got to me, he said, I want you to get up and go to the rear of the bus. And I told him I was comfortable seated where I was. He didn't say anything. He just kept on with his business, collecting the tickets. So he came back to the front, and as he passed, I told the driver, you know, I reached out with my ticket, and he said, I'm not taking your ticket, and he kept straight off. He kept straight to the door. He got off the bus and came back in about 15 minutes. And he said, I want everyone on this bus to get off except that woman that refused to move to the rear. She can stay here until this bus moves out, but it's not going anyplace tonight. You know, it was sort of like a shock. Did I just hear something that I'm understanding what the man is saying, but I can't stay on this bus by myself. And when I entered the bus station, I proceeded to the window, ticket window, and when I got to the ticket window, the lady behind the curtain, the ticket window, she pulled the curtain down and dimmed the lights. It's sort of like in a movie, you know? When she did that, I turned around, and there was a tall guy pushing a broom, and he said to me, Miss, don't you know where you are? I said to myself, oh God, Sarah, you are in trouble. I went back out to the line because there were about a couple of people still to get on the bus. And I said to the driver again, is something wrong with my ticket? He said, no, but you're not riding this bus tonight. And the policeman was standing about 5 feet away. And they said to the driver, is this the one? The driver said, yes. So one got on one side, one on the other side. He really didn't manhandle me like most people really think, you know. But it was all like in a movie that night, you know, one that probably most people had never seen before. So they locked me up for sure. So I paced the floor all night. And when you travel in dress uniform, meaning your heels, at least 1.5 inch heel. So I paced the floor all night. And I cried and I prayed. I asked God to help me. You know, it was sort of like you're breathing, but how are you breathing? You know, what is happening to me? What is happening? What am I going to do? What are you going to say to your family? You were in jail. I sort of know how I got there, but I don't belong here. The jailer came the next morning, took me to before the chief of police that I was before the night before. And the chief of police said, is that a uniform you're wearing? I said, you mean to tell me you don't know the color of the United States Army uniform? So he said to me, that's why you spent the night in jail, because you're too damn smart. All the disparaging things that I've seen happen in life, you know, the mistreatment of people that I've seen. If you don't have someone around to speak up for you, you're like a dead duck, you know. But I'd like to be remembered as someone who helped somebody along the way, you know.
No doubt a trailblazer. And even though she was just one person, even though she wasn't part of an organized action, in fact, she was literally all on her own that night in Roanoke Rapids in a potentially dangerous situation if you know anything about the South in the 1950s. But regardless, she kept her seat and in doing so took a courageous stand. But, you know, we know, again, in the Jim Crow South in the 1950s, what the law said didn't necessarily always matter. It didn't necessarily mean it was being enacted the way it was supposed to be. So in the end, Sarah Keyes was wrongfully arrested. She spent a nerve-wracking evening in jail and was eventually fined for disorderly conduct. And despite the injustice and fear and humiliation that she had endured, again, wearing the uniform of the United States Army, when she was arrested for doing nothing wrong, she refused to let this injustice go unchallenged. Even though it would take years of work, of meetings and interviews and reliving the trauma of that night, Mrs. Keyes saw her case all the way through, eventually with another North Carolina trailblazer at her side as her attorney, Miss Dovey Johnson Roundtree, served as her lawyer. Finally, in 1955, her case was settled with the Interstate Commerce Commission, ruling in her favor, again reaffirming that the segregation of Black passengers traveling across state lines was against the law. And so tonight, we are here to lift up the amazing and courageous story of Mrs. Sarah Keyes Evans, as well as situate her action in the larger context of Jim Crow segregation and transportation, as well as the pushback, the resistance against that unjust system. And so please feel free to use the Q&A feature tonight. Ask any questions you like. We'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. And we just look forward to the conversation with all of you this evening. And so on to that conversation, I'd like to invite Dr. Blair Kelly to come and join us on screen, and we'll get started. All right, Dr. Kelly, hello, hello. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. So great to see you. I want to just tell everybody a little bit about you because you're amazing. To everybody joining us, Dr. Blair Kelly is an assistant dean for interdisciplinary studies and international programs in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences and associate professor of history at North Carolina State University. She is the author of Right to Ride, Streetcar Boycotts and African American Citizenship, which won the Latita Woods Brown Best Book Award from the Association of Black Women Historians. She's currently at work on a new book, I believe, which is Black Folk, The Promise of the Black Working Class. And that was awarded a 2020 Creative Nonfiction Grant by the Whitting Foundation. If any of you tuning in feel like Dr. Kelly is familiar, she is pretty much famous. She has been featured on CNN Tonight with Don Lemon, MSNBC's All In, the Melissa Perry Harris Show, the NPR's Here and Now, WUNC's The State of Things. She's written for the New York Times, for the Washington Post, for The Root, The Griot, Ebony, Salon, Jet Magazine. And she is highlighted as one of the top tweeting historians by History News Network. She is one of, you would say, the first generation of historians active on Twitter. You can follow her at Prof. BLM Kelly. I'll ask Paul to pop that address in the chat box there for you. And that way you can all add to her over like 45,000 followers or something. And so Dr. Kelly, who I'm going to turn it over to, is just going to give us a little bit more information, not only about the Sarah Keyes story, but the broader context of Jim Crow transportation segregation and the pushback against it. And to all of you tuning in, just remember you can use the chat box or the Q&A feature. Only the panelists sees those, and we'll pitch as many of those questions as we can during our discussion right after this. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Kelly. Thank you again for your time tonight.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here and to talk about this wonderful and tremendous and historic case. So when most of us think about protesting segregation, we think of Rosa Parks, or maybe we think about the Freedom Riders. But these protests have deep roots. The civil rights generation was standing on the shoulders of a generation that fought Jim Crow from the very beginning. They were rooted in the struggles of Frederick Douglass, fighting in the 1840s to keep his seat on the Massachusetts train. Their work was rooted in the 1954 protests of a woman named Elizabeth Jennings, who sued and won in New York courts in 1854. And she spurred a citywide protest against segregationist policies on the city's mule-drawn streetcars. The activists of the civil rights movement are rooted in the protests of Black women who were arrested on Southern rail cars in the 1870s and 1880s. The struggles of the civil rights movement are rooted in the protests that led to Homer Plessy's arrest on a train in New Orleans in the 1890s. They're rooted in the streetcar boycotts that took place in 25 different Southern cities between 1900 and 1907. These protests are rooted in the activism of a person named Pauli Murray, a North Carolinian who was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a Greyhound bus traveling south to Durham for an Easter break weekend in the spring of 1940. These protests are rooted in the arrest of a woman named Irene Morgan, whose case in 1946, just 6 years later after Pauli Murray's case, led to Virginia's segregation statute being declared unconstitutional in a case called Commonwealth v. Morgan. And they were rooted in the arrest of Sarah Keys Evans. This woman, this remarkable woman you just heard about, a soldier in the Women's Army Corps, whose arrest led once and for all to the Interstate Commerce Commission, a federal body, deciding that the Supreme Court ruling of 1946 applied to private bus companies as well as public transportation. And so if any private company was trying to make its own rules, they could no longer do so because of her activism. They had to now abide by the law. I want to take a moment and reflect on what we saw of Sarah Keys Evans, her beautiful testimony in that video, all the background that was provided for us at the beginning of this story, and to remember her activism, her bravery in its true context. She was a North Carolina-born woman. She was simply trying to go home. But like all Black travelers, she knew that travel was never a guarantee. It would never automatically be safe or uncomplicated. You could never guarantee that you wouldn't be insulted or degraded on any trip. And so somewhere in her, she knew she wanted to protect herself. She bought that ticket that should have gone all the way through so that she wouldn't have to reboard in the segregated South, so that she could keep her seat and try to keep her dignity. But even in spite of her planning and in spite of her efforts, she was confronted with the unthinkable. Time in jail for Black Southerners was a frightening and awful prospect. Many people never returned from a jail cell or never returned from an arrest. And so we know that that night must have been frightening and awful to her. But she used that moment of trial to turn it into triumph, to use her struggle as a building block in what could come afterward. So when initially Keys did not want to press a case after she was arrested, but she was encouraged by her father, who was also himself a war veteran, to sue. We have to remember here that she should have been protected by the 1946 Supreme Court decision in Morgan v. Virginia that I mentioned. They had ruled there that the passenger segregation that had gone on for so long was illegal on interstate travel, and that any African Americans who started their ride in the North should have the right to remain in whatever seats they had taken at the beginning of the trip. Keyes, as we mentioned, was represented by a woman named Dovey Johnson Roundtree. She was a groundbreaking Howard Law University trained attorney who had been one of the first Black women in the Army Corps and a first Black woman who was a commissioned officer. Dovey Johnson Roundtree had also fought segregation during her time in the service, successfully protesting a colored-only table in the mess hall. And she too had been ordered to move on a bus while in uniform in 1943. On a recruiting trip through the South, she was unlawfully ordered to give up her seat on a Miami bus to a white Marine. She too was threatened with arrest, and she disembarked and found another bus to ride. So Roundtree had experienced the very thing that Sarah had experienced as well. So Sarah Keyes Evans' case was that perfect fit for Dovey Roundtree, who was this time insistent that change must come. At first, they were frustrated when early in 1953, the US District Court dismissed the suit on jurisdictional grounds. But because Keyes' journey had involved the crossing of state lines, the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, was charged with regulating interstate transportation. But initially they were rejected there too. But following the wake of the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, they tried again, arguing that Brown now should apply equally to transportation. So on November 7th of 1955, the commission issued its decision banning segregation on interstate bus travel. Though, like the Morgan case before it, the ruling would not be evenly and effectively enforced. So it's important to remember that the Supreme Court change was just a piece of it. But if states were ignoring those cases, Black riders still didn't have equal rights. But the case did serve as a stepping stone in making the modern movement. The case that Sarah Evans Keyes pushed forward, Keyes v. Carolina Coach Company, forced the ICC to stand by the Supreme Court's decision of 1946. And it became the groundwork for protests in the civil rights movement. So we all know much more about the protests of 1955 and the Montgomery Bus Boycott movement. And we probably know a bit about the Freedom Riders of 1961 that we saw in that footage from her testimony. But the Freedom Rides are important here because they remind us of the importance of this early case. The Freedom Rides were the challenge to get the federal government and state governments to enforce the Keyes case on interstate travel. And so the Freedom Riders of 1961 challenged illegal interstate segregation customs and laws that were still going on in spite of the Supreme Court's insistence. They were organized by a man named James Farmer of the Congress of Racial Equality Corps. Farmer had been one of the founding members of the Corps organization. It was a small group founded in 1942 that applied Gandhian direct action to American problems. He wanted to make the movement for a broad national challenge and wanted to send an interracial group of activists through the entire South to test buses and bus facilities using nonviolence. They were, in fact, a revival of an earlier effort, something called the Journey for Reconciliation in 1947. Activists Bayard Rustin and James Farmer of the Fellowship of Reconciliation and Corps traveled through the South as a test of that earlier Supreme Court decision in 1946 that desegregated interstate buses. There were 16 men, 8 who were white and 8 who were African American, and they only made it through the Upper South on their test. Rustin and 2 other Black men were arrested in Chapel Hill and sentenced to the chain gang in Roxborough. So these new freedom rides began in 1961 as a reassertion of that older idea of testing those cases. They rode successfully through Virginia and North Carolina. In Georgia, they met some minor violence, as they did in South Carolina. And then in Atlanta, the groups were brutally attacked in Anniston, Alabama, with FBI knowledge, and the freedom rides were restarted after about a week of regrouping. A young activist named John Lewis argued that violence could not win out and that they had to continue to fight. So he was in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He came and joined these freedom rides. He believed that nonviolence had to confront this kind of vicious brutality in order to be successful. So he restarted those freedom rides with those core activists. And in the end, they were beaten, they were attacked, but they finally pushed the Interstate Commerce Commission to enforce the Supreme Court decision and ban segregation on interstate buses in September of 1961. These changes, fought for over 2 generations, were finally realized. And so it's a reminder that we have to think about these earlier struggles, that we have to remember those who stood in the face of violence, in the face of lynching, in the face of injustice, to push for what was right. That the very first expressions of segregation were not accepted by anybody. The very first laws in the 1800s that were passed were fought by men and women who risked their lives to talk about the injustice of inequality. That women like Sarah laid bare the irrationality of segregation, the idea that a woman should have to give up her seat for a man, flew in the face of the ways in which we think about public spaces. But Black women were insistent that they were citizens, that they were women, that they needed to be recognized and seen as such. That their role in this fight was just as important as the role of men. And that when they fought segregation, they fought it on their own terms. So we remember this generation. We remember all the African-American women who were excluded from segregated spaces, beaten, thrown down, forced out, physically dragged out of their seats in trains and streetcars and buses, arrested by men, jailed, attacked by drivers and sheriffs. We remember these generations who fought segregationists and fought it bravely. When we think about their resistance, we take good courage. We remember that sometimes it takes generations to make change and to keep change going. Sometimes you even fail in those fights. The attorney, Dovey Roundtree, did not succeed in the first cases in this case, but she kept going. Change only comes when we continue, even after we have failures. That when we refuse to comply, when we know something is wrong, when you keep fighting, that's the kind of fight that's essential for lasting change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. I love that. I love that focus on resistance, which is so critical. And I just want to elevate that piece again for all the teachers with us tonight, the importance of teaching the resistance. You know, it can be very easy to get bogged down in the horrible things, the injustice that occurred, but in every period of history, as you just so eloquently shared, there has always been pushback. There has always been Black agency and resistance and resilience in spite of all of the adversity and all of the threats. And so I think that's such a powerful concept. And it's a really important reminder to all of us to elevate that resistance, because telling one part of the story without the other isn't the full story. But I just want to ask you, this period, especially from 1947 to 1961, I find it a complete quandary, right? Like and it's so interesting. The timing of the Sarah Keys case is really incredible because 6 days after the ICC announces it publicly, November 25th, 1955, 6 days later is when Rosa Parks takes her seat, refuses to get up her seat, and the year-long Montgomery Bus Boycott begins. And as you mentioned, you talked about the 61 Freedom Rides, similar to the 1947 Journey of Reconciliation. What was the problem? What was the disconnect? We have all of these years of seemingly the same fight, despite litigation, litigation victories. So what was going on in the end? What would you say finally made the difference? What finally moved the needle? Because as you said, it often takes generations to make change, but what was it that finally made that change, do you feel like?
So I think that the willingness of civil rights activists of the 1960s to keep pushing the question. So Sarah lived in a time period where she wouldn't have known, where she knew, in the video, we see her say, "Oh, I know I have the right to stay in my seat if I bought this one kind of ticket that kept going all the way through. It didn't stop in the South. It went to my final destination. And if I bought that kind of ticket, I knew I should have had my rights."
Yeah.
But I wasn't sure, because she was nervous. She was still worried. It was still on the back of her mind.
Yeah.
And so all travelers are traveling in that kind of gray zone during this time period. This is the time period of the Green Book, when Black travelers are trying to figure out where they can stay with lodgings, where it would be safe to try to seek out a meal when they traveled. So the whole journey is fraught with the possibility of danger and difficulty in facing segregation. And really, my mother's generation, she would be sent south from New Jersey and Philadelphia as a young woman to her family in North Carolina. And when she got to North Carolina, her aunt had to retrain her all the myriad laws to not sit down in the front of the bus, to not go to the water fountain. And so there's this world that, Sarah is moving from. She's moving from New Jersey. She's stationed in Trenton, and she boards the bus in a state where it was safe for her to do any number of things. It was desegregated at that time. And then she's moving into a world where it's less and less safe. And so Black life really exists in this liminal space in this time period until the Freedom Rides call the question and really say, okay, the Supreme Court has already decided this, almost 20 years prior. Can we finally get our rights? And the unwillingness of segregation is to change, and the unwillingness of the federal government to enforce really left Black life in this in-between space.
I think that's such an important consideration, the context in which she is in the Jim Crow South, where the Klan is active, where we know Black people have been killed, have been brutally beaten, just horrific things have happened with no consequences, and yet she still made this decision, and that night in jail could have gone a million different ways. So to think about that moment in the context of what was happening in the Jim Crow South just blows your mind, and how strong she was to be able to see that through.
And, she must have been thinking about her own service and her own citizenship, right? Her father's status as a veteran.
Yes.
She's sitting in her uniform.
Yes.
She's like, I'm a citizen and I know my rights, and I know what the Supreme Court of the nation has said about what I can do.
Yeah.
And, she was still vulnerable in every possible way. And so it's such a tremendous paradox that Black citizens are facing in this time period.
That was one of my favorite parts of her interview, where the police chief asks her if that's the Army uniform. And she says, "Don't you recognize the uniform of your country?" He said something like, "That's why you're in here. You're too damn smart." That I thought, I was like, she has, she has some agency there. Like
She does.
so inspirational.
And yet it's not being respected. It's not being universally
right.
seen as having meaning. And
right.
we know that there were hundreds of Black men and women who were arrested in uniform on buses, on city buses. There were men who were lynched in 1919, what we call the Red Summer, in their uniform.
Yeah, veterans.
Returning veterans who had fought in Europe, had
Yes.
fought abroad in Europe, and survived that fight only to die in their uniforms in the United States. So, that paradox, it's quite powerful.
Right. It's interesting. I read in Dovey Roundtree's biography, she said regarding, what finally sealed the deal, she said it was in the end not simply bloodshed or mass protest or fear that brought the promise of keys to fulfillment. It was shame, that it was finally kind of being called out and shamed that moved that needle too. I thought that was really interesting.
Absolutely.
So a lot of folks joining us are asking the question that I feel like I ask this all the time, which is, why have I never heard this history? Specifically, why have I never heard about Sarah Keys Evans? Why have why isn't this more of a known name? As you so eloquently said, we have to remember those who stood before us. They've lifted us up to this point. Why do you think we don't know more of us know about this?
I mean, there's hundreds of people we don't know, right? Because she's alone in this moment, and she faces it on, and her willingness to sue in this case makes a difference. However, there's so many people, so many generations that we do not know who are fighting segregation, who are also risking their lives, who are also suing. Beginning in the 1870s, a number of Black women sue train cars about segregation. Ida B. Wells is amongst them. That's her very first action as an activist in the previous century. So there's so much we don't know about the African American experience and the activists that are in front of us. There's always more to teach and always more to know. In this space, I can never say that I know it all, because there are so many stories. And so it makes sense that, when we keep elevating single stories or simpler versions of stories, sometimes we are obfuscating the more complex steps that it took to get here. We're trying to tell the story of, like, there was progress and then progress kept going.
Right.
And we don't say, sometimes the Supreme Court made a decision and a whole bunch of states were like, nah, and we don't want to do that. And I mean, that's harder to teach. It's harder to explain. But yet that's what we've experienced in this country.
Yeah, the reality is very, very complicated and in so many ways very disheartening, which is why I think, again, the resistance of Black folks themselves is such, that's where the hope is. That's where the power is in this story, I feel like, because,
and it's not disheartening, because we know in our own time that we're experiencing ups and downs and fits and starts and progress that gets pulled back.
That's right.
And so it's a reminder that is true.
Yes.
That in our history, that's the way that history has shown us that these fights for rights and justice and full citizenship will look.
Right.
And so we shouldn't get disheartened in our own moment by the backward and the forward.
Right.
That this is what the fight for rights looks like.
Right, which continues, which is a fight that we are still in today. That's exactly
Absolutely.
Right. So I want to bring on our other guests into this conversation as well, because I know they're back there chomping at the bit, wanting to chat as well. So Dr. Kelly is going to stay with us, and we're going to also have Dr. Irvin Griffin, Miss Amy Nathan, and Mr. Rodney Pierce come on. So you guys can go ahead and camera on. Hello to each of you. I'm going to say just a few words about each of you, then we're going to jump right into the conversation. This is I'm looking at you all and I'm just like all of a sudden nervous and paling in comparison, because each of you just is such an amazing historian and just doing such incredible work. So I'm going to start with Mr. Rodney Pierce, because he is the teacher in the trenches with all of you on this meeting tonight. Mr. Rodney D. Pierce is a 7th grade middle school teacher in Nash County Public Schools. He was the 2019 North Carolina Council for the Social Studies Teacher of the Year. He has served as a fellow for Carolina Public Humanities, the Center for Racial Equity in Education, and the Public School Forum of North Carolina. He has worked as a consultant with Carolina K-12, with the North Carolina Museum of History, the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, and the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. He currently sits on the Governor's Teacher Advisory Committee. I don't know how he has the time and the energy for all of it, but he is an inspirational teacher. Welcome, Mr. Pierce. Amy Nathan is with us tonight. She's an award-winning author of more than a dozen nonfiction books, including one of tonight's choices. It's around here somewhere. Her book about Sarah Keys Evans, Take a Seat and Make a Stand. This is one of your choices for your free book tonight. And it's for young readers. And she's also currently, I believe, working with Mrs. Keys Evans on another project that I'm going to ask her to tell us a little bit about later. And last but not least is Dr. Irvin V. Griffin Sr., who is President Emeritus of Halifax Community College and was the first African American to serve as president. In over 40 years. He has 40 years of service in education, and based on the transformational impact of his leadership, the Board of Trustees at Halifax Community College renamed a building after him. And Governor Roy Cooper also awarded him the Order of the Longleaf Pine for his service to the state of North Carolina. And he's also a founding member of the team for the Sarah Keys Evans Inclusive Public Art Project. And so we thank you all for being here. And Dr. Griffin, I'm actually going to start with you, since you are a member of the Sarah Keys Evans Inclusive Art Project, which unveiled this beautiful mural in 2020 in Roanoke Rapids. Could you tell us about the project, about how it came to be, and what the purpose of the project was? And maybe also, since you're local, how you came to know this story and what your interest in it was.
Okay, well, I'll tell you, Rodney brought the story to us, to be honest with you, with the Roanoke Valley SCLC. He recommended that she would be the drum major award. And I think we talked to Sarah that night at the award. Am I right? Remember, Rodney? I think I remember correctly. And after that, I was serving on a committee downtown Roanoke Rapids, and then they had something from the Z. Smith Rental to talk about people and stories that people do not know about. And Sarah Keys Evans fit perfectly. And from that, we put together a committee. I'm giving you the short version. And luckily, we were funded for that. I think one of the things that was interesting to me in putting it together, we had to get permission to put the monument in the city park, which meant that you had to go through the city council in Roanoke Rapids. And quite a few of people on the city council are people who have been around for a minute. And many of them may have been there at the time that some of these things, or they know the people who were the chief of police at the time. You know, small towns, that's the way it worked. But they approved it, but it wasn't, yay, tell the story. So oftentimes when you do these things, you start out with a small group and you have to expand outward. At least that's what we had to do. And as we went along, I think we got more and more support for it, because there's a certain level of, I think Dr. Kelly talked about shame that go along with it, because you want to think that we couldn't have done that. No, we didn't do that. And in reality, yes, you did. And that's the hard part, I think, what the question why people don't know about Sarah Keys Evans? Well, maybe it's purpose. I don't know. I'm not a historian like these two professors here, but that may be part of it. And that's why it's so important for the plaza and for other things that we're doing to bring the story here. Because if we don't talk about it now, we might be shameful. It may be shameful for generations.
That's right. That's right. And I think in the beginning, you all saw a few pieces of this beautiful installation that the project installed. And so why did you all decide to do it this way, specifically in this beautiful art installation? I ask because there are a lot of art teachers with us who know, I think we all know that art is such a powerful medium in so many ways. So I'm curious as to why art, why this way? And, also, can you talk a little bit about the artist and how you guys chose him?
Well, the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation wanted to tell the story through public art because it would be there, and we wanted it to be something that anybody that would look at it, regardless of your age, could follow everything through, and that's why we had it in a circle. And I think we discussed this. We met every Monday for almost a year. We wanted to talk about, when you do research and you want to have your outcomes, you have something about closing the loop, closing the circle, because if you don't do that, you keep going round and around. And people will still be saying in 2050, they never heard of Sarah Keys Evans. So we were trying to kind of close that circle so people would know about her. Whether you want to discuss her, whether you want to discuss the issues or not, that's up to you. But we wanted to make sure it was there. And that's how we came up with the name Closing the Circle.
That was literally my next question.
Yeah, I kind of thought so.
I love that, and I think, again, art can be such a power, for especially the teachers, art can be a really powerful entry point for kind of discussing and learning this type of hard history. I think in many ways, art, if it doesn't disarm us, it really can draw us in. I think art is great for developing empathy. It can bring us together to talk about these kinds of things. So I think you guys did a really beautiful job in the way that you designed it and told that story.
Yeah, it was it was a labor of love. And Dr. Kelly was talking about the number of people getting the words correct on the sign. Well, we did the same thing because we went over that a number of times. And I think Sarah actually read those, and she said she wanted to be remembered as a trailblazer for justice. And I think that's where we got that
and
from.
She should.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I think Mr. Pierce, I want to bring you in on this too, but I think just the thing that you said, Dr. Griffin, that really just sticks with me, and it goes back to what Dr. Kelly was saying, talking about her mother's generation. You're talking about people on the city council who were around then or knew these people then. This is history we can touch, literally, right? And I think a lot of times with young folks, and I'm sure Mr. Pierce can speak to this, they think this is long ago and far away. But this is still with us today, so much so that you just, you reach behind you for an inch and you've touched it, right? So I think that's a really powerful reminder and something that's really important when you're working with young folks, especially, to really push that perspective of how close this is. But Dr. Pierce, I know that in addition to your involvement with this team, you also worked to get a North Carolina Highway historical marker honoring Keys versus Carolina Coach Company done, I believe. So I just want to hear from you first, as a resident of Roanoke Rapids. How did you learn about this story, and what all have you done with it? I feel like we've already heard like 5 things you've done. So tell us what you've been doing and why you were so inspired to do these things, despite you being probably one of the busiest people, just being a teacher.
Well, I learned about Mrs. Keys Evans back in 2013, 2014. I was working for the city of Roanoke Rapids in City Hall at the time. and a gentleman named Lance Jenkins, who's from Northampton County, the neighboring county to Halifax, was working at the Roanoke Canal Museum and Trail. Now, growing up in the rural outskirts of the city of Roanoke Rapids, I didn't know the city had a museum. I had no idea. And so I'm on a local news website, RRSpan, and I'm reading about these things Lance is trying to do to get the museum, outreach. And I read about this incident with Mrs. Keys Evans, and I'm like, wait a minute, this happened in my hometown. I'm in my 30s at the time, and I'm like, hold on, I never learned this in school. I learned about, Sister Parks, but that was hundreds, thousands of miles away. This happened right, 10 minutes from where I grew up, and I never knew about this. And so as chance would have it, I end up getting promoted to the Canal Museum, taking Lance's job. He resigned to do something else. And so I get down there and I learned more about it because Lance had taken the liberty of setting up a civil rights exhibit in the museum. And so on one of the, I guess, plaques or things on the wall was the case. And so I'm reading about it and I'm researching it online now because I'm excited. And I learned about Mrs. Nathan's book. And so I get in touch with her because that book is self-published. So it's right there. Amy, what is it? amynathan@gmail.com or something like that. So I can email her directly. And I talked to her and I'm all excited. And I'm telling her, I grew up in this city and I didn't know. And she's like, well, she's still alive. I'm like, really? She's still alive? And I get her phone number either from Mrs. Nathan or from a gentleman who published Mrs. Keys Evans' story in a Black-owned magazine. I think it was called Our Heritage magazine. And so I talked to her on the phone, and I had just lost my grandmother that year in October of 2013. And so this is like talking to a lady from my grandmother's generation. And just, I can be very loquacious sometimes, but I'm just sitting there listening to her talk. And I'm just like, wow, this is crazy. And she's telling me about what happened. And I'm like, man. And then to build off of what Dr. Griffin says about the small town police chiefs, the gentleman who would have been the police chief at that time is none other than a guy named T.J. Davis. T.J. Davis there are two recreation centers in Roanoke Rapids. The primary one, which we would say is on the quote unquote white side of town, on the other side of the tracks, is named after T.J. Davis. So, you talk about a building being named after Dr. Griffin on the campus of Halifax Community College, my alma mater. But, you have a recreation center in your city named after a police chief who upheld Jim Crow law. And so, it's just so mesmerizing because you learn about this stuff happening in other places. And you just say, did it happen here? And then when you actually have the living, breathing documents or embodiment, you're literally on the phone with the person this happened to. And then you have a grandmother who's of the same generation, and she either didn't know about it or knew about it and didn't tell you, or knew about it and forgot to tell you, because my grandmother was born right before the Great Depression started. And so when I learned it, and then when I became an educator, I said, I have to tell my children about this. Not only my own biological children, but my students. And so that is one of the ways, that's one of the things I did in terms of getting her story more out there, being able to call her sometimes and letting her speak to the students by speaker for a couple of minutes. That really blows them away because they're like, that's her? That's the lady you letting us talk to? The one you just showed us the interview of? The video you showed at the beginning? Right. I'm like, yeah, that's her. And it blows them away because all of these people they've learned about are deceased for the most part. And she's still alive. And after Dr. Griffin and the group did the plaza, I said, well, let's take it a step further. Let's get a little closer to home. And it's funny because initially when I applied for the marker, I knew it would be on the avenue, but initially it was supposed to be probably 100 to 200 feet, Dr. Griffin, up there by Smart Start.
Yeah.
And what happened was they were like, no, you can't put it here.
Mm.
And so it actually got moved right in front of the bus station that she got arrested at. So that shows you how God works.
Wow.
So it's like, bow, right there. Right where she
You
got
can't hide
arrested.
me.
Yeah, so, and Dr. Griffin and the group actually helped on that a lot too. So, like he said, it's a labor of love. And, you know, now we have things that are standing that children and older people can come to and read and learn about this remarkable woman and her ordeal.
Yeah. You know, you got into this a little bit, but since we have so many teachers with us and, you know, you're speaking that language. Why are stories like this so important to lift up in the classroom? And I ask that because we are in a time where there's a lot of propaganda and rhetoric out there that I believe is trying to censor the teaching of history, specifically history that deals with anything hard, anything that might cause discomfort. Literally, some of these policies say this. Why is it important to elevate these stories, even given the times that we're in, or perhaps especially given the times that we're in? And can you speak a little bit more to, you started talking about this a little bit, how you've seen your students light up specifically because of doing the local history? And that's one thing I want to just say to all the teachers, you know, yes, the national is important, but when you can drill down into that North Carolina history, when you can find these stories from your town, your county, even some, you know, if it's not there, the one next door, your students are going to light up. So I'd love just to hear you talk a little bit too about how you've seen your students respond to these types of stories.
I think, speaking for myself personally, as a young man who grew up in, like I said, on the rural outskirts of the city of Roanoke Rapids, who was raised by a grandmother who grew up during the civil rights era, you know, I always wondered why things were, and Dr. Griffin can speak to this because he came here to Halifax County. He wasn't, you know, raised here like I was, but it was always like, why are things the way they are here?
Mm.
Why are we so racially divided? Why does it seem that all the white people have the power and the Black folks are just struggling and struggling? Did we ever fight back? Did we ever resist? And working that job at the museum and coming into contact with her story and then saying, okay, well, what else do I not know that happened here? And then learning about people like Lewis Austin, who published the Carolina Times newspaper out of Durham, being born in the town of Enfield, getting a marker for him, getting a marker for Dr. Willa Cofield and her federal court case that protected thousands of Black teachers in the South. She being an Enfield native, and it empowered me. It empowered me, and it made me not afraid to speak out on stuff. You know, sometimes, you know, Brother Griffin will say, Rodney, you know, you gotta chill now, you know, fall back, you know, you're getting a little, you know, but it empowered me, and it made me feel like if they did that for me, then I need to do something for the next generation. If that means teaching them in the classroom, if that means advocating on their behalf when it comes to state policies in education that I know are unjust and are not right. I'm a Leandro kid, hello, you know, was a sophomore in high school when that lawsuit was filed. Halifax County Schools grad, one of the original plaintiffs. So it goes deep with me, and it empowered me. And my hope and prayer is when I bring these stories into the classroom, as you said, that local history, that it will empower my students to go out there and say, hey, you know, these people, and some of them who are still alive, the people that Mr. Pierce is teaching us about in class, I know that man. I know that woman. They go to my church, or they, you know, they're a family friend, you know, and then we can get those oral histories possibly that we can put into the archives in the Southern Oral History Project at UNC Chapel Hill. Because sometimes, as I was telling you earlier, those elders don't want to talk about that stuff. But if it's the innocence of a child approaching them and wanting to know, then perhaps they'll be a little bit more forthcoming. So it empowered me. It made me unafraid to speak about certain things and to challenge certain things in my community. And my hope and prayers by, you know, teaching that to children, that it will do the same for them. There have been students in my class when I've taught stories of their communities. There was a man lynched in Scotland Neck back in the early 1900s. And one of the young ladies that I was teaching, when I talked about this story, she said, "Oh, I know what that is. I know where that happened. My grandmother told me about that." And she said, "It looks scary over there." You know, I had a young lady whose grandmother participated in a counter protest to a Klan rally back in 1966. You know, she said her grandmother told her how they fought the Klan and then they ran and jumped in a ditch because they thought they were going to start, people had started shooting. So that stuff comes alive for these kids when they can go back to their families and their families can confirm what I say to them in class and then take it a step even further.
Right. That's so true. It comes alive. History is no longer dusty at that point. And I just want to share, participant Valencia saying, "I love the statement, what else do I not know that happened here?" That is the heart and passion of a historian. And I think that's how all of us in the classroom need to come at this. And the other thing that you said that I think is so powerful that I want to elevate is the idea that this is empowering students. There is this narrative that history teachers are shaming and blaming and making students feel bad. This is not about shame and blame. This is about calling your students in and empowering them to look at the past, to acknowledge the mistakes that have been made, but then to build a better future. And we can't do that. We can't look forward without a look back, right?
And so I think, you know, what's really powerful to remember is that as much as the spaces around us are named for segregationists sometimes, both in local and national places and in our campuses, you know, this infrastructure is around us. But what do we do with it?
Yes.
None of the young people we are teaching today are responsible for these things in the past. What they are responsible for is what happens next.
Right.
And so it's not about shaming anybody with our past, but rather making sure that they are empowered to understand how they can do better.
That's right.
And how their communities can be responsible for making sure that the freedom we all believe in is a reality for everybody. And so shame is no part of any of this.
Right. We just need to make America be who she says she is, right? So there, you know, when you know better, you do better. But
you know what I really like about the monument that Dr. Griffin's group put up is that it's two circular arcs, and inside the arcs there's 4 mural paintings on each arc, but these are not closed arcs. There's a space between the 2 arcs, and it really struck me that space between the arcs, so it's a closing of the circle, but it's also opening. That there's a break in the circle, so that there's a chance for people to come up with different ideas. And also, he didn't mention it, that his program got a unanimous support from the city council with both white and black members. So change is hard to come by, but it goes step by step.
But it can come, yeah. Well, and so actually, Miss Nathan, I want to stay with you. You are not from North Carolina. You're outnumbered here tonight, but we're friendly.
I was born in Norfolk, Virginia.
Okay, that's close.
Does that help?
Yeah. So tell us, how did you stumble across this story, and what made you want to write this lovely book about it that all of you can perhaps choose? I just throwing, you see all these primary sources and images that Miss Nathan has done, and Miss Keys Evans herself has signed off on this. And I know you're very close, work very closely with her, but tell us how you came to this.
Well, I had written a book for National Geographic on the history of women in the military. And so I was doing research at this wonderful place. Anytime you take a trip to Washington, D.C., you should go visit it, the Women's Memorial, which the Women in Military Service for America Memorial, and it was funded originally by veteran women who raised the money at the entrance to Arlington National Cemetery. So there on the wall in the main lobby at that time, there was this plaque about Sarah Keys Evans, Sarah Keys, and Dovey Johnson Roundtree, and this victory that they won. I majored in history in college, right? I was just written this book about the women in the military, and I'd written another book on military history. And I had never heard of her, like Rodney and like Dr. Irvin. I had never heard of this. And I thought, how could this be? And so I contacted the archivists at the Women's Memorial, and they are total fans of Mrs. Keys, Mrs. Evans. They call her the Army's Rosa Parks. And so they put me in touch with her. And we had our first conversation on January 4th, 2004. And we have been talking together for the past 18 years. And so I said, would it be all right with you that we talk and you tell me your story, how this happened, and if I write a book for young people? At that time, I was mainly writing books for young people. And she really liked the idea. And so we had a lot of conversations. And then I wrote the book up. And she had told me, I said that she had a lot of nieces and nephews. And one niece in particular, Crystal Hargrave, had done a report on her when in 5th grade when she had to do a report on heroes. And so I thought, well, that would be a really good way to frame the story. Have Crystal having to write this report on a hero and deciding to write about her own great aunt. And so I chose that as the way to frame the story. And so we did this whole thing. And then I could not find a publisher. Right,
what was that? Why? What was that?
So this has happened over a number of projects that I've had. I want to tell all of you, if you want to be a writer, you have to be persistent. You have to try over and over and over again. Well, they told me, oh, that's a great story, but we already have a book on Rosa Parks. That covers the story, they've told me, people have told me in so many words that we only do stories for children about people who are household names, and she's not a household name. And also, since her story was so unknown, they thought there would never be any audience for it. So, but I had spent all this time talking to Mrs. Evans and to her sisters and her nieces and nephews, and I thought I have an obligation to actually publish this story. And so I self-published it through a group called iUniverse. And it's not the most gorgeous book. I had learned later that I should have hired a designer to make it look a little better. So, but it has
second edition.
Yeah. So yeah. So it hasn't done that badly. It got a lot of attention. It was named the Book of the Week by the Washington Post. I got a really nice review in Kirkus Reviews, which is unusual for a self-published book, I think, because it was such an unusual story. And then the people at this magazine called Our Heritage that Mr. Pierce found out about, so they then interviewed her also, and they wrote a story for that, and they had me advertised in that magazine, and I think that's how you saw the name of the book. So now we've decided, with this incredible project that Dr. Irvin's group has done, that we really need to have a book that tells the whole story. And so we've been talking more interviews with Mrs. Evans and her family members, and I had these 2 manuscripts, and Dr. Kelly has agreed to read the manuscript and give me some advice on it, because again, having trouble. They say, oh, this is a great story. This is just really wonderful to be told, but she's not a household name. So we're trying to make her a household name.
As she should be. So, Amy, since you've spent so many, I think, 15, almost 20 years talking,
18 years talking to Mrs. Evans.
18 years with Miss Evans, what strikes you the most about her? Like what do we need to know about her that we may have not gotten from the history, from the, the textbook version? What do we need to know?
She's tough. She's very tough. She's very determined that things should be done the right way, and that I should not make any mistakes in the way I tell the story.
Her story, that's right.
Right. And she's very, very quiet. She's a quiet, reserved person. She did tell me in a couple of her interviews that she was shy as a child, and then she said, I never said I was shy. And I said, well, yes, you did. I have it written down here that well, I'm reserved. She prefers reserved. But she is very reserved. She's not going to put herself forward. And this experience that she had in 1952 really has affected her life going forward. And she never told the people in the Army that she served with when she went back to Fort Dix after. She only told her two best friends, one white and one black, and she never told anyone else about it because she wasn't sure that maybe something else bad might happen if people found out about this. Maybe other people wouldn't think it was a good thing that she did. And she has gradually opened up to me and told me the story. And I think it's interesting what Mr. Pierce said, that he related to her because he had just lost his grandmother. But I had just lost my mother shortly before this, and I never had a grandmother. I never knew my grandmother. And so Mrs. Evans has sort of played that role in a way for me, this someone I can talk to. And so I'm really hoping that we can get her story told to a wider audience. And she's very oh, that's right. I was going to say the World Trailblazer. The way that came was she got an award from the Department of Justice in 2006, the Trailblazer Award from the Department of Justice, and it was given at the office of the Justice Department in Brooklyn, New York. And at that, she invited me to come, and that's where I actually met in person all her family members. I'd been interviewing them on the phone. And so did a number of people who live in her apartment building where she has lived since 1953.
Wow.
And they had never heard this story until they got the invitation to come to this ceremony. So she's very reluctant to put herself forward because she can never be totally sure how people are going to react, because that first experience from 1952 was so distressing, and she really hates to tell the story again. And we had to really persuade her to tell it for Dr. Irvin's group to get that documentary made.
So that's actually comes at a question Esther is asking about the concept of the experiences of Black people in the South, the trauma that goes with that. We were talking, Dr. Kelly got into this a little bit, but I'd like to just ask you all, she was this courageous freedom fighter, but it's a difficult thing for her to relive. I think we often forget that this is a very personal, very traumatic situation for many folks who are in this situation. It can feel life or death. You're feeling humiliated. I mean, it's such a complex situation to be in. So I'd love to hear if any of you want to speak to that, that kind of the lifelong mental toll that something like this can take. I think for us as historians, we get excited. We're like, oh my God, this is the greatest story. But then for the person, they're kind of like, okay, you're asking me to relive one of the hardest moments of my life. Dr. Kelly, can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think there's two layers to this. I think it's important to remember the context in which she was raised. She would have been told the importance of not being arrested, of never, being to lose your power to the police. Because to be arrested and to be Black in the Jim Crow South means any number of terrible things can happen to you, and that there would be very little that your community could do other than maybe come claim your body if something went wrong. And even sometimes they couldn't do that.
Yeah.
So the degree to which the fear of jail, the John Lewis and some of the SNCC activists talk about part of their work in becoming civil rights activists in the 1960s, a whole generation later, was overcoming that fear of jail, taking that power away and reasserting their, to fill the jails instead of letting the jails have power over them. But we have to remember that in previous generations, jails meant death. That the chain gang, a sentence of the chain gang at the turn of the century when I write was a death sentence. People died within 6 years. The brutality of a prison system that ended up being more brutal than slavery, because at least in slavery, there was an ethic of keeping the person alive because they could have children and you would own them too. But in jail, you were completely disposable.
Right.
And so that is the context in which her parents were raised, in which they raised her. Yeah. And so in that moment, she must have just it must have been the most frightening thing she could think of, even though she knew she was right, even though she was brave, even though she was a soldier in her uniform. She still had that knowledge of all the suffering and the difficulty that came before her. And the other piece of it is that we don't often think about Black trauma. We take for granted that Black people see brutality, that they experience brutality, that they, are getting stopped by police at a much higher rate, that they are experiencing things that are frightening for themselves, for their children, for their elders, all the time. And that we never pause to think about the cost and the toll that has on our psyche, even our children's psyches, right? So Rodney is in the classroom with our young people, and they are still a generation that are seeing Black men and women be brutalized. It's now on their social media. It's something that they know could happen to them. And so we have to pause and honor the difficulty of telling this kind of story again, the sadness, the trauma, the shame. I'm sure when she returned to New Jersey, she was worried that it would threaten her career, that she wouldn't be who she was working to be if they knew she had been arrested, because they wouldn't think of it as something to be proud of. And so there's so many layers that she must have lived through and is still experiencing in this moment in retelling that story. But it's important for us to think about the ways in which many of us are experiencing those same kinds of burdens in this current moment.
Yeah, and such an important reminder for our teachers, when you teach this, to keep that in mind, for all children, for the Black children in your class, to keep all of that in mind, to make sure, just like the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm, right? So I think that's really important. Did any other, Rodney, did you want to weigh in on that too?
I wanted to add something.
Oh, go at it.
Not relevant to it. Mrs. Nathan can speak to this because I got it out of her book. But one of the things I think that's lost in Mrs. Keys Evans' story that's not talked about as much as it should be. In our country, we love to, especially politicians, we love to honor military. We love to honor military families. The sacrifice that you are making. And, we think about the sacrifice of the actual service member, the sacrifice of their family, their children, their spouse, their loved ones, their friends. Mrs. Keys Evans, correct me if I'm wrong, Mrs. Nathan, at the time of her arrest, both of her brothers were serving in the Korean War.
That's right, yeah.
And her father was a Navy veteran. This is a woman who comes from a military family.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So it's deeper than her just being arrested in her military uniform. This woman is serving in the Women's Army Corps, and her brothers are literally on the other side of the world. And her father is a Navy veteran.
Risking their lives for
this.
Yes,
and we love to talk about how much we respect and admire.
Thank you for your service.
Yeah, we love talking about that, but she wasn't afforded that courtesy. She wasn't afforded that. And I think that's something that's lost in her story that we don't talk about enough, that she was a member of a military family, African Americans, Black people who were sacrificing their lives for a country that always didn't love them back the way that they loved it.
That's right.
That's a tremendous point. African Americans have served in every war in America's history. There is no war in which they did not serve. One of the women I mentioned who got arrested on a streetcar in New York City in 1854, Elizabeth Jennings, her grandfather was a veteran of the American Revolution. And so I think it's both important to remember the dislocation that Black people have had from that honor that should have come from their service. And also to remember that made them even more determined. It's no accident that these stories can be traced through our veterans, our Black veterans, who are tremendously resistant in every case. The book I'm writing about Black working class resistance is filled with people who served and who were determined to fight for their rights. Yeah. So it's a common important thread.
And I think too, the role of Black women historically and present day, I think Black women have stood up, stepped up, carried the burden of the world on their shoulders, and they haven't received their due credit. And this is another example of that, I think. So I think it's also really important when you tell the story of the civil rights movement, elevate the role of Black women in that movement. You think here in North Carolina, we have the Greensboro sit-ins, and we tell it as a story largely of A&T University and the men who sat in, which is an incredible story. But what about the women at Bennett College who are involved in the organizing too?
Right.
So let's lift up those Black women. Dr. Griffin.
Can I make a comment? I was thinking about the trauma. I remember I'm older than all these young folks here. I remember the first job when I left Western Illinois University and I had my degree and I thought I was ready for community college education. And I was asked, and I'd worked with 14,000 students at Western Illinois, 85% of them are white. I was asked during an interview, and I won't tell the place where I was, whether I could work with white students. And I've thought about that over the years, and I said, well, I don't know. I wanted to say, I wonder, can you? Because they were making all those judgments. And then I could not figure out, when I first got to Halifax County, why every place that I went, every time they invited me to speak at a men's day or something on Sunday, all those things, you have to do that. That there were so many older people who always wanted to hug me and say, we're so glad you're here. And I never believed it was going to happen.
Wow.
And I didn't quite get the context until I was there about 6 or 7 years. And I was standing in line at a local, I'm not going to tell you the name of it because some people may know. You know where I was at, Rodney. And this guy who had a website, they said was 27870, something like that. He said, how these good old boys treating you? This is a white guy. And I'm in the line, I'm all dressed up, I thought, he said, how they treat me? I said, everything's going pretty good. He said, don't let that fool you. And that has stuck with me even to this day and everything. And I thought I got along, but there is a certain level of trauma that goes along with being the first of anything. Those two places, I was the first African-American there and the first here. And the other part of it, as Blair was talking about, I couldn't fail. They needed, you've got, everybody else can fail and get another presidency. I couldn't, because if I failed, they weren't going to hire anymore, because I would carry that total burden of being successful there. And that's why I often tell Rodney to just keep your head down a little bit, fella. You want to be around for a minute or two.
Wow.
And I think those are life lessons that would go along with this. And you notice how Sarah, she's not angry. She keeps everything on even keel. She's not, as my mother said, I'm not going to let you run up my blood pressure. She doesn't let that happen. And that's something that I think we need to be teaching too, how to get, she got results, but she didn't have to go way to the left or to the right. And she just did what was right. And she's reaping the rewards for it, I believe.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's so important. It's an important perspective for all of us to have and to remember, related to that piece of trauma and that feeling of not being able to face. I mean, that's a pressure cooker in so many ways, right? That people that look like me won't necessarily be thinking about because they've not had to. So I appreciate you sharing that. And we're coming up on the end of our time here. I have a couple of last questions though. Mr. Pierce and Dr. Griffin, I specifically wanted to hear from you as Halifax County folks. The mural has been installed, the marker is installed. Is it enough yet? Has Roanoke Rapids, in your opinion, done enough? Has Roanoke Rapids atoned for this wrongful arrest? Can you speak to that, or are you gonna get in trouble?
I'll go first. I did want to say, I'd raised my hand a few moments ago. I did want to say that as an alumnus of Halifax Community College, when Dr. Griffin was the president there, I was always very proud that a Black man was the president of the community college that I was going to. And then pledging the same fraternity as he pledged later, you know, that's my older fraternity brother. But Dr. Griffin started a program years ago called Local African American Heroes. And when you talk about leaving a legacy, you know, he's no longer the quote unquote president, he's president emeritus, but that program still goes on to this day. And, you know, we can always say, hey, look, that was started by Dr. Griffin, and it recognizes African American people in our community who are making a difference.
Yes.
So we do have our heroes.
That's right.
You know, Mrs. Keys is one of them, and then we have the local ones who we're around and that we see every day. And that was, you know, thanks to him and his team. So I definitely, that's what I wanted to try to get out there prior to answering this question. I would say no. There's always more that can be done. I think Dr. Griffin and his team are working on that with the Congressional Gold Medal efforts. Is that correct, Doc?
That's correct.
Right. With those efforts, I know Mrs. Nathan and I talked about something a few months ago, and I'm not going to speak on that because I'm not permitted to. Maybe she can, but I won't. But there are always, with Mrs. Keys Evans, because of what she endured and what she went through, I always think that there can be more done. Excuse me. I really think the community at large, I don't know of too many educators who actually talk about her case in their classrooms. I could be wrong. I know I do. And I have a colleague who does, who teaches at the middle school my daughter attends, but I don't know of people who really teach it locally like that. And so I would like to see it like embedded in like at a district office level, at a school district level, in curriculum, like you're going to teach this.
Right.
Like there's no getting around it. She got arrested on August 1st. We're going to teach it the first month of school. I mean, that's fine with me. But
can that be Sarah Keys Day locally?
That is today. We have it every year.
Every year. So you do have a public celebration, but you know, are the kids really learning about this in the classroom?
Yeah.
You know, from elementary to middle to high school. I think that's something that should be mandated, particularly in Weldon City schools, Halifax County schools, and the Roanoke Rapids Graded School District. And
statewide. She's a
right.
hero.
That's right.
And, but here locally, you have the marker and you have the plaza to help you tell the story.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
and you do.
Oh, okay. So go on. Good diaper.
And you do, but Rodney, the place where the bus station is now, where Rodney got the marker, all of a sudden it's cleaned up. That's originally where we wanted to put it. The place where the jail is now condos. So a lot of the places that you would use as markers for what happened to her, they have been changed somewhat. I think people have accepted it as a part of it, but as far as the level of understanding that this is part of your history, and we need to think about what we do as far as our policies and procedures and how we do things to make sure that we always talk about being inclusive and open and all that. I'm not so sure about that. I can say that now. I'm retired. I don't have to worry about all this other political stuff that they have to deal with.
Safe space.
But I think it is accepted to a certain degree. We do have people who will come to the presentations. We had a big group. We always have a great turnout. But the point of it is, I want something afterwards where everybody is coming to the plaza. We put a counter there. We have the website that's super interactive. You can have your kids take the tour on the website. and write about that. And we have it being narrated and all of those types of things. I just wish it would be a part of when they're going to go all the way to Atlanta to visit something. Well, they can come right here. You go right to Roanoke Rapids Park, Martin Luther King Park, and you've got history right there.
That's right.
And I think that's the type of thing that I would like for us to embrace and to make sure that, you know, what is she, 93 now?
93 as of last month, right?
That's
Yeah.
right. So
Well, and Paula shared your website in the chat box, so everybody has that. And again, Carolina K-12 is finishing up a lesson plan for all of North Carolina schools to teach about, as Dr. Kelly said, not just Halifax County, all 100 counties need to teach this incredible story. So we're going to be sending that out to all of you. And if all of you with us tonight share it with a few colleagues, we can start to really make sure we elevate this incredible, courageous trailblazer. Amy, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so in Washington, North Carolina, her hometown, now has an Underground Railroad History Museum, and they have embraced the story. And they do readings of the book on various times during the summer, and they had the book there, and they are doing a good job of teaching the story to the people in Washington, North Carolina. So the story is becoming better known. And also, if you go to the website of the Dr. Griffin's website, you'll get to hear Professor Blair, who gave a discussion, which I think probably helped a lot in getting the unanimous decision passed.
Absolutely.
For the monument.
That's right. Well, so we're a little over time. I'm notorious for going over time because when I love history, I cannot let it go. So I've kept you a little bit late. I'm sorry for that. But the last thing I do want to say is I do want to, I want to elevate you again, Mr. Pierce, because you are a teacher in the classroom. And I think I really want to impress upon all the teachers here tonight, all the ways that you as a teacher in the classroom have worked to elevate this story and a lot of other local history, not only in your classroom, but to the community at large. So these applications you're doing, this research that you're doing, you are a really wonderful example of a teacher as a scholar and a teacher as a professional historian. I think it's so easy for those of us in the K-12 classroom to disconnect from that identity, to not have that identity in this world that is deprofessionalizing, if not demonizing teachers as hard as it possibly can. So I think your scholarship is just really, really inspirational, and you have an incredible appetite for it. And I just want to say to all the K-12 teachers, to do this if you can. You know, we hear a lot about self-care, and hearing that makes me grumpy. I find it patronizing. I find it unrealistic. What I like to say is teachers need to invest in yourself. And one of the ways you can invest in yourself is by connecting to that role as a scholar, connecting that role as a professional historian, and doing research like this. You know, when you blog about it, write about it, take a class, when you can stay in that world of a professional scholar, I think it can help you push through a lot of the noise that you have to deal with. And it's also an important way to remind yourself that you are a valued professional when there's so much out there trying to take that from you. And so that's going to involve letting some things go. Invest in yourself. Leave the papers ungraded, right? Invest in yourself. Skip the car line. I don't care what your principal says. You've got to start to say no, prioritize your own time, and invest in yourself. And I've seen you do that, Mr. Pierce, and I hope that other teachers will take a page out of that book from you.
And when you do that, you end up being supported by people like Dr. Griffin, Dr. Kelly, Mrs. Nathan, Christy Norris, Dr. Kramer. I know he was out there earlier. Carolina K-12. Because I think a lot of times people are afraid that if I do that, am I going to get the support I need to continue that kind of work? And the support is there. Sometimes people are just waiting for you to take that leap of faith and get it started.
Carolina K-12 is waiting on all of you. Come to us. Let us know what you want to do. And actually, I'm going to ask Paul to put in an opportunity in the chat box right now with the North Carolina Literature Review, which is, we just put out a call for submissions for teachers to write about how they're using North Carolina literature in the classroom specifically to teach hard history. So if you use Amy Nathan's book, for instance, in your classroom, you can write about that experience and get published and paid by the North Carolina Literary Review. So Paul will pop that information. That's just one quick example where you could start tomorrow kind of connecting and really identifying with that role as a scholar. We know it's hard. We know you're tired, especially after these few years. But I think in the end, it really can reinvigorate you and kind of be one of those ways to help you get through. But so I just want to say again, as I close out our time here, thank you so much to all of you, Miss Amy Nathan, Dr. Irvin Griffin Sr., Mr. Rodney Pierce. We appreciate you for joining us. Dr. Blair Kelly, thank you for that wonderful presentation, for your incredible work. I am 100% sure you gained some more Twitter followers this evening. So we appreciate all of you. Thank you so much. I'll let you camera off and go on about your evening, but we just keep doing the wonderful, amazing work that you're doing. We appreciate you. I also want to thank again our co-sponsors for this evening, the Sarah Keys Evans Inclusive Public Art Project. Make sure to visit their website, which Paul has shared in the chat box. You can see the full interview with Mrs. Sarah Keys Evans there. You can also see a virtual tour of the exhibit. So even if you can't get your students to Halifax, you can show them that. Thank you to the North Caroliniana Society, true appreciators of teachers. They're our partners tonight and are providing the money with a little bit of additional funding from Humanities for the Public Good initiative that is going to allow us to send all of you a book. And on that note, I'm going to ask Paul to put in a Google form into the chat box. You guys will fill that out and select the book that you want of 3 amazing choices, My NC from A to Z. Just so you know, this is a beautiful book. It's an art book, and the K page represents Miss Sarah Keys Evans. And then, of course, you have Amy's book that we've talked about, as well as Mighty Justice, the story of Dovey Johnson Roundtree that you can choose between. So fill out that Google form. Also, we'll be following up with a recording of this program for all of you, as well as a lesson plan and all the resources that were shared tonight. To you amazing teachers that have been experiencing a time like no other, who are tired to your bones, but still show up and stay with us till 7 o'clock, 10 minutes late, past 7 o'clock. We thank you. We thank you. We lift you up. We honor you. We view you as pillars of our communities and valued professionals and scholars, like I was talking about earlier. As I like to say, you're the glitter and the glue. Hang in, hang on. Summer is right around the corner. Thank you for being here. And lastly, thank you to Mrs. Sarah Keys Evans, not only for the courageous action she took on August 1st, 1952, not only for then having the tenacity and the dedication to see her case through, which took years in the courts, but also for her willingness to tell her story, to relive those difficult moments, all so we can learn and grow and know better and do better. If we can take just a minute on our toughest days, we will feel behind us and holding us up strong women just like her that are pushing us to continue this long struggle and ongoing fight for civil and human rights. Let's do that for her and honor her in that way. So as we'll close out, I'll be in the chat box if you have any remaining questions, and otherwise enjoy a little bit of inspiration from, I think Paul's going to play us out with another song by the awesome Nina Simone, and we will be in touch with all of the resources from tonight in the next couple of days. Thank you. Good night. Take care.